Good afternoon, everyone here in Vienna or joining us from Europe. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you're joining from. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this VCDNP webinar today with David Santoro on the future of US-China nuclear relations. My name is Hanna Notte. I'm a senior research associate with the VCDNP. And I just want to state upfront that this event today will be on the record. Even though China remains a relatively weak nuclear power when compared to the United States and Russia, it has in recent years become central to US strategic policymaking. You could argue that in recent weeks, with global attention focused on the war in Ukraine and amid instances of nuclear saber rattling by President Putin, concerns about China's nuclear program perhaps have taken a backseat in public and media discussion. But recent US strategic documents and official statements certainly leave no doubt that China remains the United States' long-term geostrategic pacing challenge and a country which the United States believes intends to become its military peer by 2035, as General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, just said at a US House Armed Services Committee hearing just a few days ago. Our guest today, David Santoro, recently published a volume called US-China Nuclear Relations, The Impact of Strategic Triangles, in which he and his co-authors examine how the US-China strategic nuclear relationship evolved, where it's headed, and how one might characterize a series of strategic triangles involving the United States, China, and other third actors. And in today's webinar, David will discuss the findings and recommendations of that recent work, as well as related issues. Just a few words about our guest today. David Santoro is president of the Pacific Forum. He specializes in strategic deterrence, arms control, and non-proliferation. His current interests focus on great power dynamics and US alliances, especially the role of China in an era of nuclear multipolarity. He also leads several of the Pacific Forum's Track 1.5 and Track 2 strategic dialogues. And prior to that, David worked on nuclear policy issues in France, Australia, Canada, and the UK. And he's a prolific writer on nuclear issues and has co-edited and authored several books, essays, and articles on the topic. And with that, really, I turn it over to David for some initial remarks.
Thank you very much, Hanna. Thank you for the very nice introduction. And thank you to the Vienna Center for receiving me and for the opportunity to give this talk. I'm very, very happy to be here. I guess I should say that this is my first time at the center, not in Vienna. I've been to Vienna many times, but never to the center. So this is a great pleasure to be here. And this is, for that matter, my first international trip since the pandemic began. So I'm, again, very happy to be here. Now, I thought I'd stress up front that I literally just arrived from Washington, D.C. a few hours ago, and this is a topic I like, so I'm not going to fall asleep. But if I do, don't be surprised. But I should be okay. As Hanna, as you mentioned, I will be focusing on US-China nuclear relations. And I understand today that, especially in Europe, in this part of the world, when we talk about nuclear issues, we tend to focus more on Russia, on US-Russia relations, NATO-Russia relations, and we certainly should, given what's going on right now. It's basically impossible not to focus on that. But I want to focus on China, and I want to focus specifically on the US-China nuclear balance in this talk. And I hope to convince you that this is a problem worth paying attention to, like Hanna mentioned. And in fact, I will argue that this is, I think, our biggest problem over the long term, or at least on par with Russia from a Western standpoint. And so in this talk, I want to make 3 points. Point number one, I want to explain that there is and will continue to be what I call tighter US-China nuclear coupling. And that's because simply China is becoming a near-peer nuclear competitor to the United States. That'll be my first point. Point number two, I would argue that this isn't good news, that it will lead to less, not more stability. And I'll explain that there are, in fact, already today, several pathways to nuclear use between the United States and China, some more realistic than others. That'll be my second point. And then my third and final point will be about extended deterrence and extended deterrence in Asia in particular. And here I would argue that it's going to get a lot more complicated and it will require some updating. In particular, extended deterrence in Asia has been essentially an afterthought for a long time, and now it must receive serious attention. So that's what I'll be presenting on. So let me move on to my first point. China is becoming a seriously capable nuclear-armed power. Now, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, the Chinese nuclear arsenal was essentially quite small. It was vulnerable, and Beijing maintained its forces at a relatively low state of readiness. And so China's no first use policy was credible because Chinese forces were not big, and based on their posture, there was very little indication that Beijing was considering using those forces. And so China was not much of a nuclear problem. At least it was, maybe a small nuclear problem at best. Now, a lot has changed in just 10, 20 years because China has been expanding its arsenal, and it's been perfecting it, especially under Xi Jinping, so since 2012. And so we've seen both quantitative and qualitative change in Chinese forces. Now, to be clear up front, quantitative growth has been, at least until recently, relatively modest, in part because China started from a very low baseline. What has been the most significant is qualitative change. So quantitatively, the Chinese nuclear arsenal is really in the low hundreds. And so we have multiple independent organizations that say that the Chinese probably have between 300 to 350 warheads, nuclear warheads. And as you know, the US and the Russian arsenals are in the thousands. And so, a doubling of the Chinese arsenal would not overmatch the US or the Russian arsenals, and not even a tripling or quadrupling of that arsenal. And I say that not to minimize the problem, but to put it into perspective. And I think an important point as well is that we, at least in the United States, have consistently overpredicted the future size of the US nuclear arsenal. Now, having said that, evidence has surfaced over the past year that suggests that China is now conducting a crash nuclear buildup. So things are clearly changing and changing fast, at least based on the new evidence that surfaced last year. Now, qualitatively, many Chinese decisions point to Beijing's interest in improving the survivability of its arsenal. So one possibility is to say that China is, or maybe primarily interested in building an effective second strike capability to further entrench a situation of mutual vulnerability with the United States. And this is in fact the official Chinese justification for its modernization program. They basically say that they're building up to counter the United States, and there is evidence to back that up. So a few examples. Beijing has improved the mobility of its forces by investing in road mobile intercontinental missiles, which makes it difficult for an adversary to locate and destroy its forces. We've seen investments in a sea-based deterrent. That's another example, because simply subs are less predictable launch locations. And Beijing has also been extending the range of its forces to target the United States, and it's been adding nerves, most likely to penetrate US missile defenses. So that's one way of looking at China's qualitative modernization program. Now, there's another way of looking at it, which suggests that Beijing is in fact considering new missions for its arsenal, including tactical nuclear use and nuclear warfighting. So consider, for instance, China's DF-21 and DF-26 missiles, which are intermediate range missiles that can carry both nuclear and conventional warheads. The DF-26 in particular has what we call hot swapping capability, which means that it can rapidly shift between launching nuclear and conventional variants. And that missile, by the way, is also very accurate and has a long range enough to actually reach Guam. So even if no first use remains in place, Beijing may be looking at the possibility of limited nuclear counterforce as opposed to just counter-value second strike options. Now, to add to this, there are reports that Beijing is modernizing its nuclear command and control systems and conducting exercises to improve force readiness, including by mating warheads and missiles. Now, it's very, very important for everyone to understand that all this is very new for China. For the longest time, Beijing maintained a demated force, and now there are talks about the possible adoption of a launch and warning posture. In addition, Beijing has increased its power in the cyber and space domains, and it's been working hard towards an integrated deterrence posture, especially through its new Strategic Support Force Unit, which is a unit of the People's Liberation Army. So, these are the different ways you can read what China has been doing. And, while all this has been going on, there has been virtually no shift in US policy. And that's another point that I want everyone to understand. The United States has not responded to Chinese developments and deployments for various reasons. One is simply Washington had other priorities. Another is that there was a belief in Washington that China was part of the solution to address these priorities. Think of North Korea, think of Iran. But the fact is that the United States did not make major adjustments to its deterrence posture in the Indo-Pacific to account for China's new capabilities. What Washington has done is strengthen deterrence almost exclusively with an eye on North Korea. And that strategy has not targeted China. And the United States has made clear, in fact, that missile defenses will not undermine the strategic balance with China. This is very clearly laid out in US official strategic reviews. This is actually said explicitly. So what does that all mean, basically? Where does that leave us? So I think what it means is that today, we do not have a US-China nuclear peer relationship from a quantitative standpoint. We do have one or close to it from a qualitative perspective. And so from that perspective, again, qualitatively, not quantitatively, China has been catching up with the United States. And again, very important for everyone to understand, this is a big, big change from 10, 20 years ago. It's a big change because we used to think of China as a future nuclear problem. We knew that China was modernizing. We didn't really know what it was doing and to what end. And of course, there's still a lot we don't know. We still don't know how many nuclear warheads is enough for Beijing, for instance. But China is no longer a future nuclear problem. We know that much. Now China has developed and deployed new capabilities. So from a US perspective, it's a present problem. There is also no indication that that problem is going to get smaller. In fact, I will argue that it's set to become bigger and a lot bigger. So that's my first point. Let me now move to my second point and explain why I think that the future of US-China nuclear relations is going to be bumpy in the years ahead. So I'll begin with this first. One line of argument is to say that Chinese modernization will in fact solidify a situation of mutual vulnerability between the United States and China, and therefore this will actually strengthen US-China strategic stability by reducing the risks of conflict because of the fear of escalation. And especially so because China has had a defensive military strategy, one that Beijing labels active defense, quote unquote, active defense of Chinese sovereignty, and one that therefore only promises a counterattack, not a preemptive attack, just a counterattack. And so from that perspective, the outcome of Chinese modernization could need more stability, not less, if you look at it that way. Now, a negative outcome is also possible. Chinese modernization might fuel competition and lead to arms race instability and crisis instability. And that could happen due to the fear that even if China does not seek numerical parity with the United States, Beijing has already reached some strategic equivalency and therefore will feel more confident with a more sophisticated arsenal. And it will just become more aggressive or at least assertive at the conventional and sub-conventional level. And just a minute ago, I mentioned China's active defense strategy. And yes, it is defensive in nature. But remember that Beijing seeks to protect Chinese sovereignty in a system in which it considers its sovereignty to be incomplete because that system reflects the so-called century of humiliation. And so from that perspective, the future could be less stable, not more stable, especially at the regional level, basically in the Indo-Pacific. Now, on balance, I think that the negative outcome is more likely. We have seen Beijing, adopting essentially a more assertive posture in recent years. I can't see how that would change if Beijing develops a more sophisticated arsenal. I think it's likely to continue and intensify, not decrease. I think it's also important to remember that during the Cold War, it was precisely the fear of an emerging stability-instability paradox, to use a technical term. It was precisely the fear that led the United States to intensify its competition against the Soviet Union, even as Washington and Moscow found themselves increasingly entrenched in a situation of mutual assured destruction. And I simply think that similar developments are likely in the US-China context. First, because the United States is well ahead of China in the nuclear domain. So, the United States will, I think, find it easy and in fact tempting to increase and seal its superiority over Beijing, particularly as the conventional balance of power is shifting in China's favor and shifting very fast. Second, and this is really the theme of the volume that Hanna very nicely advertised at the beginning of this talk, because China is not the only nuclear armed state that the United States worries about. China is certainly a growing concern. It's a central concern, I would argue as well, and I expect the nuclear posture review that will be coming out in the next few weeks to be heavily focused on China. But I would think that, especially given what's going on right now, China could come after Russia as a nuclear problem. And of course, the United States also worries about North Korea. And so the United States is adapting its posture with other nuclear armed states in mind, and these changes will have indirect consequences for China. So even if the United States did not want to get into nuclear competition with China, it could happen anyway. And of course, China is in a similar position. Beijing worries primarily about the United States, but it also worries about India and maybe about North Korea. And I would also not exclude Russia. I would argue that China worries about Russia as far as nuclear issues are concerned. And so that's why I think that we're likely to see tighter US-China nuclear coupling. And all this is basically likely to fuel US-China nuclear competition. Now, that being said, I want to now turn to what I see as the possible risks of nuclear use between the two countries right now and in the future. And I'll talk about three potential risks. First, nuclear aggression and preemption. I think that's a low risk. It was certainly a concern in the US-Soviet context, and it clearly has not disappeared in the US-Russia context today. But I think it's unlikely in the US-China context, because again, the Chinese arsenal is too limited in comparison to the US arsenal. And so Beijing basically knows it does not have first user advantage. And of course, the United States, I think, has no interest in starting a nuclear war with China. So I would characterize that, the possibility of nuclear aggression or nuclear preemption, as a fairly low risk. Second, unauthorized nuclear use resulting from the diversification of the Chinese arsenal. I think that's a moderate risk. Many tend to dismiss that risk because they argue that even though Beijing is developing and deploying new nuclear platforms, the risk of unauthorized use is low because there will always be strong political control over those weapons, and that's been the tradition in China. That may be true. I'm still concerned just because there's a very, very rapid pace of developments and deployments. And I don't know if the Chinese will develop systems in place to keep pace with what they're developing. And so I would characterize that possibility, again, the possibility of unauthorized nuclear use as a moderate risk. Third, and final, nuclear escalation during a conventional conflict. Now, I think this is the highest risk. One pathway is a situation in which China is losing a war, for instance, over Taiwan. There's other example. So you have China losing a war, and it chooses to resort to nuclear use to force the United States to give up the fight. Another situation is, again, during a war, you have the United States striking Chinese nuclear forces with conventional weapons, which then prompts Beijing to resort to nuclear use in response. Now, I think this is realistic, given the entanglement between Chinese nuclear and conventional forces. And I mentioned earlier the DF-26, and that entanglement seems increasingly pronounced after the restructuring of the rocket forces of the People's Liberation Army, which is the unit in charge of land-based missiles in China. And so to me, this is the real risk. Again, nuclear escalation during a conventional conflict. So from my perspective, the most important qualitative developments by China are the diversification of the arsenal and the entanglement of Chinese conventional and nuclear assets. And these are important because I would argue the most dangerous because, again, there is no official US-China dialogue on these issues. And therefore, neither Washington nor Beijing has a good understanding of the other's red lines. So let me quickly move to my third and final point. I think this is important that I say a few words about extended deterrence, and particularly extended nuclear deterrence. So obviously, I think the dynamics that I've described will complicate US commitments to its Asian allies simply because the costs and the risks are now higher with a more nuclear capable China. I don't think it means that these commitments cannot be met, And in fact, a key lesson from the Cold War is that we can effectively deter an adversary even if we do not dominate him. And right now, as I've mentioned, the United States is still very much dominant over China in the nuclear domain. Also, and this is another important point to keep in mind, US allies are concerned about the changing balance of power, but they worry primarily about US resolve to act if necessary, more so than whether or not the United States has the capabilities to act. And I'm not suggesting that capabilities are not important. They very much are important, in fact, essential. But I am suggesting that current nuclear dynamics may require more software than hardware with allies. And, you know, as an aside, philosophically, I also don't think that we should attach the credibility of extended deterrence to specific capabilities. That's a slightly separate point. All that to say that in my recent volume, I talk about the need for greater integration between the United States and its allies when it comes to deterrence. And for the record, I talked about integrated deterrence before it was cool, it became cool to say it. So I'll take credit for, at least in the US national security community, everybody now this is the new buzzword, integrated deterrence. But I talked about integration because I think that going forward, deterrence is going to be a collective effort, not something that the United States, that solely the United States provides. And of course, the United States will continue to extend its nuclear umbrella over its allies, but the allies will also contribute to deterrence much more so than in the past. And just to give you, I guess, an oversimplified picture of the evolution of extended deterrence in Asia, and I promise I'll finish with this. In the 2000s, we in the United States told Asian allies, we'll take care of you at the higher ends of the conflict spectrum. So there's a big war and nuclear use, but we want you to do more at the gray zone level, essentially at the sub-conventional level. That was in the 2000s. Then in the 2010s, the message became, we want you to pick up more at the conventional level. Basically, the United States began to ask its allies much more systematically to take on a greater share of the conventional deterrence and defense burden. And I think where we are now in the 2020s, it seems to me that the message is we, the United States, need to further integrate planning and operations at higher levels, including nuclear level. And I think this is motivated in part by a rising interest among allies in having a greater sense of nuclear enfranchisement. And some also talk about developing their own nuclear weapons. And so by involving them a lot more in US operations, you can do deterrence better without necessarily having allies to go nuclear on their own. So I think these are the trend lines. I think they will continue. And we're likely to see more integration between the US and its allies in the context of China's nuclear rise, if I can use that expression. And especially so because, again, the United States has other nuclear adversaries, particularly Russia, as we all know today. And so there's a need for the United States to rely a lot more on its allies. Anyway, I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, David, for setting the scene in such a great and comprehensive way. Participants can now ask questions, please, by using the Q&A function rather than the chat function. I think some questions have already started to come in. I will ask you one question, David, while others sort of gather their thoughts and write their questions. So in the last few days or weeks, we've seen a few leading nuclear analysts caution that really in the current geopolitical climate, it's very hard to see a path forward for any nuclear arms control or cooperative security measures, whether that's between the United States and Russia, the United States and China, or really anyone else. And I saw a tweet by you commenting that this is true if we stick to the traditional notion of arms control, meaning formal and verifiable treaties, but that other forms or arrangements could indeed be possible and might actually be more appropriate to current times. Could you elaborate how that could look like regarding the United States and China? I mean, you mentioned in your talk that there's, essentially no dialogue even on red lines, for instance. So what do you consider possible, especially in the US-China dimension going forward?
Sure, thank you, Hanna. That's a great question. I think it's a very current question. So initially, to the first part of your question first, initially arms control was not meant to refer solely to formal, verifiable treaties. That's how we conceptualize arms control these days. But at the time, it was a lot broader than this. If you go back to the definition that Thomas Schelling and others were giving, they were talking about dialogue, confidence building measures, crisis management, mil-mil relations, and yes, formal treaties as well, but it was a lot broader in concept. Now, the way it's developed over time, particularly in the US-Soviet and then the US-Russia relationship, has been through formal, verifiable treaties, and that's fine. But I think that these days, given that you have, first of all, many more actors, second of all, many more weapons, many more domains that you have to take into account, we are unlikely to be successful if we solely shoot. I say shoot for. I probably shouldn't say that in that conversation. But if we solely try to aim for formal treaties, so we have to, I guess, have a broader appreciation of what can be done, and what can be done. You asked about the US-China context, is simply crisis management. As you said, and as I mentioned in my talk, we don't have nuclear dialogue with China. So where we could start is by establishing some form of a hotline, some form of maybe even dialogue, official dialogue, before we can do anything, to try and identify things that we both agree we should avoid. For the longest time, I'll give you one specific example. We, the Pacific Forum, have run a 1.5 US-China nuclear dialogue at the 1.5 level, and we tried to sort of identify areas of common interest between the United States and China. And one of them was to agree on rules of the roads, especially in the cyber and space domains, and the impact on strategic stability. So could we try and agree, for instance, to not target nuclear command and control systems with cyber and space capabilities? Could we agree to that? I mean, that's a specific example of things we could do. And I'll finish with this because I want to get to the other questions as well. But we need to remember also that in the US-Soviet relationship, arms control as we know it, formal verifiable treaties, started with the hotline agreement in 1963. So it started with, I guess, a crisis management mechanism. We need to remember this, and we need to think along those lines when it comes to the US-China relationship, and frankly other relationships as well, given where we are.
Thank you for that, David. I'll move to questions from our guests, and we have a few questions from Hiroaki Nakanishi, so let me try and sort of group them together. The first is really about, there's no parity of nuclear forces, and many scholars have argued that involving China in nuclear arms control is only achievable once that parity with the US has been achieved. Do you agree with that view? And then if even yes, is there any way for incentivizing China for joining any arms control dialogue and effort, for instance, jointly reducing nuclear risks, increasing transparency, confidence building measures, a trilateral arms control among the US, Russia, and China. And he's giving a few examples here. Can a joint R&D and operation of new missile defense systems, for instance, an interoperable Aegis laser railgun missile defense system neutralizing these missile threats, incentivize China for arms control and disarmament? So a few questions here packaged within one question. Perhaps I'll leave it at that, and then we'll go to other ones.
No, this is great. Thank you. So I'll make 2 points. Point number one, I don't think that we will get to arms control with China anytime soon. I think at least the Chinese I've talked to have made it very clear that they are not interested in again, and here I'm talking about formal verifiable treaties. That's unlikely to happen anytime soon. Anytime soon. So no limits, no reductions in weapons are likely to happen, at least over the next few years. I think there is potential in the crisis management space. And I say that very carefully because my experience is you really have two groups in China. You have people that have, I think, studied the benefits of crisis management and want to engage with the United States and others in that space. So, establishing hotlines, identifying areas where we can do confidence building measures, and so on and so forth. So those, you could characterize that group as, I guess, the engagers. And then you have another group of Chinese that seem to say, yeah, Washington wants to do crisis management, but you're the ones creating crises around China. And then you turn around and say, Beijing, help me solve them. We are not going to do this. So that's my assessment of where China is when it comes to crisis management. So there is potential because you have Chinese that are interested, but there's also resistance. And I would argue that that second group seems to be the dominant group right now. I think crisis management makes sense. I don't think that the United States is after trying to trick China by doing crisis management. I think we really believe that there are areas of mutual interests. So again, the first step is to establish official dialogue and continue, unofficial work. But without that, this is difficult. And then the second point I want to make very quickly is I think there are niche areas where we can do some work. One is hypersonics. I don't think that we can do trilateral arms control, but there are trilateral things that we could do. Hypersonics may be one of them because the three powers that are the most advanced in that space are really the United States, China, and Russia. And so we could, again, at the conceptual level right now, envision maybe some form of limits at some point. But I see that, in a relatively distant future.
Just a quick two-finger from me on that, David, if I may. The announcement earlier this week that the AUKUS partners would also work together more in the hypersonics realm. Do you see that as inhibiting the kind of dialogue that you just suggested?
Not necessarily, no. I think, in many ways, it could help drive that. Saying, whoa, too much is going on. We can still control that technology. Why don't we sit down and talk about what we can do to at least establish some guardrails? So no, I think, nothing's going on right now anyway. So if we see more people getting involved in that space, maybe this is when we decide to step up and try to control it.
All right, thank you. Let's go to the next question. Someone asks here or says, capabilities by the United States over its front in relation to its allies' relations, okay. But then shall we presume there shall not arise bilateral relation between the US and the PRC in the near or medium-term future over their nuclear arsenals? ?
So I'm not sure I understand the question. Could the nuclear relationship between the United States and China, I guess, become more important than the relationship that the United States has with its allies?
That's how I understood it. But if this is not what the author of the question had in mind, perhaps he could unmute himself to clarify, or sort of clarify further in the chat function. Otherwise,
I mean, if this is the question, I will say it very unlikely that the United States will cut off its allies and negotiate with China on arms control or anything. I think we're more likely to see consultations, and we've seen that in the lead up to the nuclear posture review, allies have been deeply involved in those discussions. So I don't see that as a risk.
Let's move to another question, and if the author could clarify if this is not what they had in mind, then we'll come back to it later. We have another question here. Don't you think China would be limited by its no first use policy in a conventional conflict where it was losing, and where limited first nuclear use might become attractive?
No. Short answer, no. Now, I'm not saying no first use is useless, but it is a declaratory policy. And so, I would argue that all bets are off when the first shots are fired, even at the conventional level. So now, having said that, I think that China really believes that it has a no first use policy, and that I would even argue that no first use has guided the way China has developed its forces. But the way the program seems to be developing, and the pace of it as well, to me, is pushing the boundary of no first use. I'll give you just, I guess, one example. For a long time, when I was talking to Chinese strategists, and I was asking whether no first use was a real policy or not, they said, yes, it is absolutely true. Look, we are not mating our warheads with our missiles. And therefore, because that would require some time, we don't have any intention to strike first. Now, what's going on? China is developing a sea-based nuclear platform. You can't separate warheads and missile in a sub. They have to be mated. Now, that doesn't mean that China has a first use policy, but the argument that you could prove no first use by pointing to the fact that China has a demated force is gone. So technology is going to force policy change, I think, or at least de facto. So no, I don't place a lot of trust in China's no first use policy.
All right, David, you mentioned earlier that perhaps there are subsets of issues that the United States and China could talk about, and you mentioned hypersonics as one such set of issues. Let me sort of take some questions together which ask about other subsets. So one is whether we can talk with China, the United States can talk with China in terms of minimizing or restricting dual capability. And whether it is even technologically possible to ensure the verifiability of dual capability of any missiles with China. And then relatedly, another subset would be maritime security. So what kinds of measures and steps related to maritime in the Indo-Pacific would be necessary for the United States and its allies in terms of strategic stability for talking arms control and disarmament. So perhaps, dual capability, maritime, we can take those together and then move on.
Sure. Frankly, I don't know about dual capabilities. I just don't know how we can approach it. I think this is just too far in the future. We are not talking about this assumes that we have a good understanding of where we are, how we, how we need China to tell us what the doctrine is for dual systems. We don't know enough about it. We don't even know how those capabilities would be used in war. In in the dialogues that I'm running, or that I was running, at least the 1.5, it's a dialogue that ran for 15 years. Only in the past 2 years, 3 years, could we have a discussion on escalation. Before that, the message that we got from our Chinese colleagues was, we don't need to talk about escalation. We have a no first use policy. So whatever happens will not escalate to the nuclear level. And therefore, you don't have to worry about the fact that we have dual capabilities. So, before we can talk about how we're going to limit or even reduce those systems, we need to have a discussion about what those systems are, how they are meant to be used, and so on and so forth. And so starting the discussion as we need to limit those systems is going to be very, very difficult right now. So I can't conceptualize how that could go. On maritime, so I think maritime is very interesting because there are a number of confidence building measures in place already in the maritime space, particularly an agreement, 2 agreements that I have to check again, that were concluded in 2014, I'm sorry. And so I think that we probably in the arms control community should look at those systems and see to what extent we could emulate them to advance crisis management in whether it's in cyberspace or nuclear. I think we need to get to nuclear confidence building measures, and one way to do this is to look at what we already have in a US-China context in the maritime space. Now, and this is important to remember as well, it's good to have a crisis center, to have confidence building measures, to have hotline. It's only good if someone picks up the phone when there's a crisis, because if no one picks up the phone, you can have all the mechanisms you want. That's not going to help you. And so that requires, people that are authorized to discuss, obviously, sensitive issues. It requires training, and it requires that you speak the same language, and you don't send, bad signals. So when I say it's good to do crisis management, to create hotlines, there's a lot of things that goes, that need to go into this. Some training, some understanding of what we're doing. And so I think it's a rich agenda of work, and we should absolutely look at what's going on already in the maritime security space.
Thanks for that, David. We have a question about nuclear weapons-free zones, where someone's arguing, this is the appropriate way to phase out nuclear weapons under strict international control. Why is this not happening at the moment? So what's your take on nuclear weapons-free zones, particularly as you think about Asia Pacific?
I don't think that this is an item of discussion, at least in the US-China context. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on where you sit, but it's not been a major focus. The discussion seems to be, what is it that we can do bilaterally? What is it that we can do trilaterally? And what is it that we can do at the P5 level? Now, that doesn't mean the regimes are useless. I think, China has an interest in keeping the NPT alive. And it wants to be very active in other forums as well. But I don't think we've ever had a very in-depth discussion on nuclear weapon-free zones. Not even on the Bangkok Treaty, which would seem to be the nuclear weapon-free zone that should be in focus. So no, I don't think that this is a promising avenue to engage.
Thanks, David. We have 10 minutes left, so anyone who still wants to type some questions, I'd encourage you to do so now. I want to turn to a question by my colleague here at the VCDNP, Louis Reitman, who asks about Chinese transparency. He says China is notoriously uninterested in being transparent about its arsenal and posture. Do you see any scope for China to share details about their missiles, loads, positions, tests, etc., with the United States?
So what Chinese strategists will tell you is that they are very transparent at the policy level, but not at the capability level. They will point to the fact that they have a no first choose policy, that they have negative security assurances, that they've had all this since 1964 when they first exploded a nuclear device, but they are choosing not to be transparent on what they have, the type of weapons they have, where they have them, what the modernization program is for, simply because they have a smaller arsenal. And they think that if they were to reveal all this, then they would become even more vulnerable than they already are. So that's the backdrop. Now, I would argue that the Chinese, at least between the early 2000s through to the mid 2010s, have become a lot more open, even when it comes to capabilities. We have learned a lot. I have learned a lot talking to Chinese strategists about what they have, how they think about doctrine, things that we traditionally said China doesn't want to talk about. But I think now where we are is in a space where there's very little interest for openness and transparency, especially as China is now moving towards what seems to be a crashed nuclear buildup. So we moving back to more openness, to I guess a time where they're not interested in sharing a lot about what they're doing. And so no, I don't see the future to be very bright when it comes to transparency. In fact, I'll share with you an image that a Chinese strategist once told me. He said, if you get invited to someone's house, you're not going to visit the entire place and everything, and your host is not going to show you everything. And it seems that, and he then explicitly said that it seems that this is what you, US, want us to do. Basically, you want us to show you everything we have in our house, and then you'll be happy. And we're not prepared to do this. So no, I don't think that we can expect much. And that's why I think arms control in a formal, verifiable way is unlikely right now. The best we can do is try and understand each other better and avoid the worst. Inadvertent escalation should be the focus on crisis management. Because it's inadvertent, it should be in both of our interests. So that should be the topic in focus in the US-China conflict.
Thank you, David. I have another interesting question here, which brings Russia into the conversation. You mentioned that there is distrust between China and Russia on nuclear weapons issues. Would you therefore dismiss claims that the United States needs a larger nuclear arsenal to deter both of them simultaneously? What's your take on that?
So I'll start by saying that I have been surprised by how much Russia and China have cooperated basically since the end of the Cold War, but especially starting in the 2010s, including in very sensitive areas. And we've seen a number of joint statements on global strategic stability and so on and so forth. There's also Russian cooperation on early warning. Moscow is helping Beijing develop early warning systems, very sensitive technologies. Now, I don't think that they are at the level of nuclear cooperation and nuclear sharing. I don't think that they're there. I also don't think that they would be interested in doing this. So I don't worry about them sharing and sort of putting their arsenal together and creating a gigantic arsenal. So I'm not worried about this. Now, what I worry about is about the United States having to face two big nuclear superpowers. That's never happened before. China is still small, much smaller than Russia, and so on and so forth. But as I tried to present in my talk, it's becoming a near peer. And so the United States will have to face two major nuclear superpowers. Do I need that? Do I think that as a result, the United States needs to increase its nuclear arsenal? Frankly, I'm not sure. I don't want to rule it out, but I don't think that this is necessarily the best use of funding. I think there are a lot more productive things that we can do, especially at the conventional level. And one important thing is that at least in Asia, we keep talking about the fact that the conventional balance of power is shifting in China's favor. And so I think beefing up that part of the deterrence is more interesting and more useful than beefing up the nuclear component. Doesn't mean that we should ignore the nuclear component, but it means that it becomes a priority issue.
Thank you for that, David. Perhaps I'll take sort of one last question since we're approaching 5 o'clock here in Vienna. So someone is asking in the chat whether China has the capability to lead a discussion with the United States to get the Russia-Ukraine war to stop. And I want to sort of build on that and ask you sort of about Chinese perceptions really in the context of the Ukraine war and what it means potentially for regional proliferation, because it appears that countries across the globe could conclude from what we've seen in recent weeks that being a non-nuclear weapon state in this world is a dangerous thing, since you can be compelled and coerced by a nuclear weapon state, and that therefore you might be better advised developing a strategy of nuclear hedging, for instance. How do you think China looks at that reality? Is China concerned by that?
So China already has nuclear weapons. I don't think that China worries about other states developing nuclear weapons around its periphery. Sometimes you get some Chinese that are a little worried when they see the Korean debate, which is really in Asia, the one country that is having serious consideration as to whether they should develop nuclear weapons. But besides that, no, I don't think that this is something that they fear. You got to remember as well that China already has multiple nuclear adversaries: India, North Korea, the United States, of course, U.S. allies around its periphery. And I mean, frankly, I think China already sees nuclear U.S. allies are as not de facto nuclear states, but they know that the United States extends its nuclear umbrella over these allies. And so they are, in Beijing's eyes, a nuclear problem. And when it comes to Ukraine specifically, I think one of the lessons is that if you adopt a denial strategy, if you're able to either prevent or delay an invasion, then you're a much better off position, because you can resist, and therefore you give the time necessary for sanctions and all the rest of it to have an effect on the aggressor. So that's one of the conclusions that China could draw. Now there are others as well. Russia is resisting as well. Not everyone is implementing sanctions. I would argue that if it is China, we probably are less likely to see support for international sanctions, just because China is a lot more integrated. The Chinese economy is a lot more integrated in many more countries than Russia is. But I think it's a little too soon to tell what the lessons will be on the Ukraine conflict.
All right, thank you for that. And with that, we'll come to the conclusion of this event. Thank you so much, David Santoro, for joining us today at the VCDNP. I'm now certainly excited to read your book. And yes, and since we actually have you here physically with us in Vienna at our offices, we are lucky to be able to continue the conversation with you after we go offline. And I wish you a fruitful stay in Europe. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for the questions.